Chapter 2. It was after midnight when Tom started home. Mr. Greenleaf had offered to drop him off in a taxi, but Tom had not wanted him to see where he lived. In a dingy brownstone between 3rd and 2nd with a rooms to let sign hanging out. For the last 2.5 weeks, Tom had been living with Bob Delancey, a young man he hardly knew. But Bob had been the only one of Tom's friends and acquaintances in New York who had volunteered to put him up when he had been without a place to stay. Tom had not asked any of his friends up to Bob's, and he not even told anybody where he was living. The main advantage of Bob's place was that he could get his George McAlpin mail there with the minimum chance of detection. But the smelly John down the hall that didn't lock, that grimy single room that looked as if it had been lived in by 1,000 different people who had left behind their particular kind of filth and never lifted a hand to clean it, those slithering stacks of Vogue in Harper's Bazaar, and those big Chi-Chi smoking glass bowls all over the place, filled with tangles of string and pencils and cigarette butts and decaying fruit. Bob was a freelance window decorator for shops and department stores, but now the only work he did was occasionally jobs for Third Avenue antique shops, and some antique shops had given him the smoked glass bowls as a payment for something. Tom had been shocked at the sordidness of the place, shocked that he even knew anybody who lived like that. But he had known that he wouldn't live there very long, and now Mr. Greenleaf had turned up. Something always turned up. That was Tom's philosophy. Just before he climbed the brownstone steps, Tom stopped and looked carefully in both directions. Not but an old woman airing her dog, and a weaving old man coming around the corner from 3rd Avenue. If there was any sensation he hated, it was that of being followed by anybody. And lately, he had it all the time. He ran up the steps. A lot of sordidness mattered now, he thought as he went into the room. As soon as he could get a passport, he'd be sailing for Europe, probably in a first-class cabin, waiters to bring him things when he pushed a button, dressing for dinner, strolling into a big dining room talking with people at his table like a gentleman. He could congratulate himself on tonight, he thought. He had behaved just right. Mr. Greenleaf couldn't possibly have had the impression that he had wangled the invitation to Europe. Just the opposite. He wouldn't let Mr. Greenleaf down. He'd do his very best with Dickie. Mr. Greenleaf was such a decent fellow himself. He took it for granted that everybody else in the world was decent too. Tom had almost forgotten such people existed. Slowly he took off his jacket and untied his tie, watching every move he made as if it were somebody else's movement he was watching. Astonishing how much straighter he was standing now. What a different look there was in his face. It was one of the few times in his life that he felt pleased with himself. He put a hand into Bob's glutted closet and thrust the hangers aggressively to right and left to make room for his suit. Then he went into the bathroom. The old rusty shower head sent a jet against the shower curtain and another jet in an erratic spiral that he could hardly catch to wet himself, but it was better than sitting in the filthy tub. When he woke up the next morning, Bob was not there, and Tom saw from a glance at his bed that he hadn't come home. Tom jumped out of bed, went to the 2-ring burner and put on coffee. Just as well Bob wasn't home this morning. He didn't want to tell Bob about the European trip. All that crummy bum would see was a free trip. And Ed Martin, too, probably, and Bert Visser, and all the other crumbs he knew. He wouldn't tell any of them, and he wouldn't have anybody seeing him off. Tom began to whistle. He was invited to dinner tonight at the Greenleaf's apartment on Park Avenue. 15 minutes later, showered, shaved, and dressed in a suit, and a striped tie that he thought would look well in his passport photo, Tom was strolling up and down the room with a cup of black coffee in his hand, waiting for the morning mail. After the mail, he would go over to Radio City to take care of the passport business. What should he do this afternoon? Go to some art exhibits so he could chat about them tonight with the Greenleafs? Do some research on Burke Greenleaf Watercraft Incorporated so Mr. Greenleaf would know he took an interest in his work? The whack of the mailbox came faintly through the open window, and Tom went downstairs. He waited until the mailman was down the front steps and out of sight before he took the letters addressed to George McAlpin down from the edge of the mailbox frame where the mailman had stuck it. Tom ripped it open. Out came a check for $119.54, payable to the Collector of Eternal Revenue. Good old Mrs. Edith Double Super Row, paid without a whimper, without even a telephone call. It was a good omen. He went upstairs again, tore up Mr. Superall's envelope, and dropped it into a garbage bag. He put her check into a manila envelope in the inside pocket of one of his jackets in the closet. This raised his total in checks to $1,863.14. He calculated in his head. A pity that he couldn't cash them, or that some idiot hadn't paid in cash yet, or made out a check to George McAlpin, but so far no one had. Tom had a bank messenger's identification card that he had found somewhere with an old date on it he could try to alter, but he was afraid he couldn't get away with cashing the checks, even with a forged letter or authorization for whatever the sum was. So it amounted to no more than a practical joke, really. Good, clean sport. He wasn't stealing money from anybody. Before he went to Europe, he thought he'd destroy the checks. There were 7 more prospects on his list. Shouldn't he try just one more in these last 10 days before he sailed? Walking home last evening after seeing Mr. Greenleaf, he had thought that if Mr. Supero and Carlos de Sevilla paid up, he'd call it quits. Mr. de Sevilla hadn't paid up yet his need, a good scare by telephone to put the fear of God into him, Tom thought. But Mrs. Supero had been so easy, he was tempted to try just one more time. Tom took a mauve-colored stationery box from his suitcase in the closet. There were a few sheets of stationery in the box, and below them a stack of various forms he had taken from the Internal Revenue Office when he had worked there as a stockroom clerk a few weeks ago. On the very bottom was his list of prospects. Carefully chosen people who lived in the Bronx or in Brooklyn and would not be too inclined to pay the New York office a personal visit. Artists and writers and a freelance people who had no withholding taxes and who made from $7,000 to $12,000 a year. In that bracket, Tom figured that people seldom hired professional taxmen to compute their taxes, while they earned enough money to be logically accused of having made a $200 or $300 error in their tax computations. There was William J. Slatterer, a journalist, Philip Robillard, musician, Frida Hone, illustrator, Joseph Gennari, photographer, Frederick Reddington, artist, Francis Carnegus. Tom had hunched about Reddington. He was a comic book artist. He probably didn't know whether he was coming or going. He chose 2 forms headed Notice of Error in Computation, slipped a carbon between them, and began to copy repeatedly and rapidly the data below Reddington's name on his list. Income, $11,250. Exceptions, deductions, $600. Credits, nil. Remittance, nil. Interest, he hesitated a moment, $2.16. Balance due, $233.76. Then he took a piece of typewriter paper stamped with the Department of Internal Revenue's Lexington Avenue address from his supply in his carbon folder, crossed out the address with one slanted line of his pen, and typed below it, Dear Sir, Due to an overflow at our regular Lexington Avenue office, your reply should be sent to Adjustment Department. Attention of George McAlpin, 187 East 51st Street, New York, 22, New York. Thank you, Ralph F. Fisher, General Director of Adjustment Department. Tom signed it with a scrolly, illegible signature. He put the other forms away in case Bob should come in suddenly, and picked up the telephone. He had decided to give Mr. Reddington a preliminary prod. He got Mr. Reddington's number from information and called it. Mr. Reddington was at home. Tom explained the situation briefly and expressed surprise that Mr. Reddington had not yet received the notice from the adjusting department. That should have gone out a few days ago, Tom said. You'll undoubtedly get it tomorrow. We've been a little rushed around here. But I paid my taxes, said the alarmed voice at the other end. They were all... These things can happen, you know, when the income earned on a freelance basis with no withholding tax. We've been over your return very carefully, Mr. Reddington. There's no mistake. And we wouldn't like to slap a lien on the office you work for or your agent or whatever. Here he chuckled. A friendly personal chuckle generally worked wonders. But we'll have to do that unless you pay within 48 hours. I'm sorry the notice hasn't reached you before now. As I said, we're pretty busy. Is there anyone there I can talk to about this if I come in? Mr. Reddington asked anxiously. That's a hell of a lot of money. Well, there is, of course. Tom's voice always got folksy at this point. He sounded like a genial old codger of 61 who might be as patient as could be if Mr. Reddington came in, but who wouldn't yield by so much as a red cent for all the talking and explaining Mr. Reddington might do. George McAlpin represented the tax department of the United States of America. Sure. You can talk to me, of course, Tom drawled, but there's absolutely no mistake about this, Mr. Reddington. I'm just thinking of saving you your time. You can come in if you want to, but I've got all your records right here in my hand. Silence. Mr. Reddington wasn't going to ask him anything about records because he probably didn't know what to begin asking. But if Mr. Reddington were to ask him to explain what it was all about, Tom had a lot of hash about net incomes versus accrued income, balance due versus computations, interest at 6% annum accruing from due date of the tax until paid on any balance which represented tax shown on original return, which he could deliver in a slow voice, as incapable of interruption as the Sherman tank. So far, no one had insisted in coming in person to hear more of that. Mr. Reddington was backing down, too. Tom could hear it in his silence. All right, Mr. Reddington said in a tone of collapse. I'll read the notice when I get it tomorrow. All right, Mr. Reddington, he said, and hung up. Tom sat there for a moment, giggling, the palm in his thin hands pressed together between his knees. Then he jumped up, put Bob's typewriter away again, combed his light brown hair neatly in front of the mirror, and set off for Radio City.